Chapter 3 this morning. Excuse me. Romans 3. How many of you have ever seen like a bar or of gold or silver, like a real one, not on TV? Well, any kind of, like bar-ish. When I was a kid, my dad, one of the jobs that my dad has worn many a hat, made a career out of not having a career. But one of the jobs he had for a while was working for a guy who did mining and precious metal recovery. And one of the things that they did primarily, other than mining, this is out in Colorado, they did gold mining and some other stuff. But they did silver reclamation from X-ray films. They actually use silver in X-ray films. That if you have enough quantity, you can chop them up, soak them in cyanide, and actually extract the silver from the films. And so that was one of the things that this particular business did. And so it was an interesting process, lethal really, because vats of cyanide are just really, there's just no good thing that can come from that except for the silver. But it's adverse to the human body in more than a few ways. But I remember a time when my cousins came out from, at the time, New Jersey, and one of the things that you can do in Colorado is you can go panning for silver and gold in the creeks up in the mountains, and you actually occasionally will get something. And it's just kind of a hobby people do. They go panning, and for whatever reason, my cousins decided they wanted to go panning for gold, and so went panning and spent most of the day up, knee deep in ice water, because in Colorado, even in summertime, the streams are just barely above freezing. It is cold. There's nothing about Colorado that isn't cold, actually. But so they went out and got a large whopping 0 for the day. So I remember going with my dad back to the shop where he worked, and he didn't want them to go away empty-handed, and so he had decided to make them a small silver ingot to take home with him. And so we went through the whole process of taking this sludge and putting it into a mold, and mixing the chemicals with it and throwing it in the kiln and waiting for it and pulling it out and taking the slag off, which was interesting. This dark green glass. It was very cool looking. And then repeating that whole process a second time, remelting it, putting more agent in, getting more impurities out. Until what we were finally left with was an ingot about yay big, about 2-3 inches wide and about 1 inch tall, and that had been purified a couple times, and so was chemically as close to pure silver as you could pretty much get. And so he hit it with a stamp they had there, pure silver, 99.999 pure. And this is the kind of stamp of pure metal. And that seems like a good thing. Silver, if you could get, that 5/9 pure metal silver, even today, silver prices aren't great, but that's still worth a little bit. Not bad. And most of us would look at that high a percentage as being really pretty good. It's like saying, have you ever said, I'm dove sure? You never said? I say that. What is the, the dove, their purity thing? What is it? Is it Ivory Shore? Yeah. Okay, Ivory Shore then. So what is 99? Oh, Ivory Shore, okay. So is it 99.99 and 44/100% pure? If I remember the thing correctly, even though I can't remember the product name. And so you have 99 and 44/100. So I'm Ivory Shore, which is to say I'm certain most of the way. And we look at those kind of percentages being really, okay, that's good. I can take that. I can live with that. I'm 99% sure. But are there some areas in life where that's really not good enough? standing on your knee. I love you, Ivory. 99 and 44 100%. I will be faithful 99.999% of the time. And ladies, if your husband says that, you have my permission to deck him.
Come on now.
Because it just doesn't, it does, but if you hit her, I have to hit you. And then, no, it's just, our courts are set up such a way, just not a good idea. Never a good idea. A gentleman never hits a lady, period. There are other ways, but no hitting.
Can you define lady? I'm not saying my wife.
I guess I should start by defining gentleman. So anyway, wow, we are far afield. So there are instances where we can readily imagine that 99% just isn't good enough. Like this afternoon, for instance, we're hoping the Patriots give it more than 99%. And some of us have already not happy about this game. Don't care. What's that? Oh, yes. We'd love to have 100% of the team, for instance. 99% of the team means Vince Wilfork is gone because he's two people. So there are a lot of instances in life where 100% really is the minimum acceptable percentage. Anything less than 100% simply isn't acceptable anymore. Can anybody think of another instance? Okay, the Patriots is kind of a silly one, but an instance where that might be true that you can think of.
Where
100% is the only acceptable.
Oh, when you jump out of an airplane.
Okay, if your parachute is not 100%, probably either are you. Good. Or find somebody who's more competent, yes. Salvation, 100%, because 99% is, there's only two options, and 99% lands you in the wrong one.
You think we are in church or something?
So as long as we're there, let me take you to Romans chapter 3, because that's where I was heading exactly. Because the reality is, when it comes to salvation, when it comes to just life in general, if we wanted to work our way to heaven, if we wanted to earn our own way in, because there people do, trying to live a good life and be good enough to get to heaven, hoping that my good deeds outweigh my bad deeds enough that I can get to heaven. Have you heard this? Okay, so let's see, what does the scale need to be for this to happen? Right, 100%. Because God is sinless, 100% without sin, pure, holy, pick your adjective. And he cannot stand sin in his presence, which means in order to get into his presence, you have to be sinless, 100% pure. Ivory pure, not good enough. So if you're going to earn your way to heaven, just understand what that requires. 0 sins. That's only been done once in 10,000 years. Jesus, and he kind of had the advantage of actually being God. So, so this, I'm just saying, if you want to go that route, fine. But here's what God says the requirement is. Anything short of that is not enough. So let's begin Romans chapter 3. I want to begin in verse 1, reading down to verse 8, and I'll try to read and stop. What advantage then has the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision?
Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God.
For what if some did not believe? Will their unbelief make the faithfulness of God without effect?
God forbid, yea, let God be true, but every man a liar. As it is written, that thou mightest be justified in thy saying, and mightest overcome when thou art judged.
But if our unrighteousness command the righteousness of God, what shall we say? Is God unrighteous? Who taketh vengeance? I speak as a man.
Certainly not. For then, how would God judge the world may come, as we are slanderously quoted, and as some affirm that we say, their condemnation is just.
Now, there's several things in this, and we enter into, in Romans, if you want kind of a synopsis of the book of Romans, we may have said this already, and bear with me if I'm repeating myself. But the book of Romans is basically Paul's treatise on salvation. Everything to do with salvation, everything that basically that we know about salvation, that we understand about salvation, is rooted in the book of Romans. Paul was going through this great, and he attacks the idea of salvation from just about every angle. Practically, doctrinally, philosophically, theoretically, just comes at it from all these different perspectives to talk about this. And one of the themes that he'll visit several times in the course of the book is the contrast between Jews and Gentiles. And in fact, we get into chapters 9, 10, and 11. He actually goes in through a whole kind of parenthetical diatribe on that is really tailored specifically to Jews, though he was writing primarily to Gentiles in the city of Rome. So you have that, and he says, look, there is some advantage to being Jewish, historically, racially, these things. And so, again, you get the idea, and it's actually, unfortunately, a church-driven idea throughout history that, the Jews are somehow second-rate and we should bash them. Paul's like, no, not really. Jesus was a Jew, Paul was a Jew, Peter was a Jew, James, Jew, all these guys, they were Jews. So it's really hard to pick on them and still be Christian, though people try. But the crux that he gets into here is actually kind of in verse 7, and he attacks it in kind of a different way. He says, if the truth of God has increased through my lie to his glory, why am I also still judged as a sinner? And so he takes an argument that is true, and he builds on top of it this question that he's going to ask. The argument that he builds is this, that my sin proves God is righteous. That every time I sin, I prove that God is righteous and he is right to exclude me based on my sin. I just proved the point that I need salvation. Every time I sin, I prove his point. And so our sin proves in that respect that God is righteous. But then he asks the question, okay, well, if my sin proves that I am God, that God is righteous, then why is that a problem for God? He already said it was righteous. So my lie, he says, is to his glory. And then he asks, should we just keep sinning? Is the question he's eventually going to ask with this whole line of questioning. The answer of which, of course, is no. Okay, good. You got that one. A little scary there. But he says, look, the fact that we are so sinful, it just reinforces and reiterates God's righteousness. You think about, when we think about God, regardless of what our concept of a higher being would be, which is, kind of the popular vernacular, do we generally think of someone or something that is superior to us, thus the moniker of higher being, right? And depending on your definition, that can be a lot of different things. But universally, this idea is, or at least should, we aspire to whoever or whatever our concept of God is, they are superior to us in some way, is at least the notion. Now, the problem that we run into, Paul specifically and the church at Rome run into, is that the Roman pantheon of gods, were they higher beings? Not particularly. They may have been more intense beings. Intensely warlike, intensely, I don't know if I can say that word in church, intensely debased, how's that? Intensely, a lot of things, but superior? Not often. And so Paul's saying, look, there is this underlying thing within us that says God should be better than we are, because if God's not better than we are, we don't really need him particularly. The last thing we need is one more equal running around. But there is this notion buried deep within us that God should be better than we are. And so every time we sin, we prove how good God actually is. And so that's the argument that he's making through this, that, my sin, but it doesn't give me an excuse to keep doing it. Look at me, I'm going to wallow in sin just to demonstrate how awesome God is. You kind of miss the point at that point. And so you can only take this particular argument so far. And so the question, I guess, is this: to what extent do we take forgiveness for granted? Always, yeah. You ever heard this expression? Let's see if I can get it right. Forgiveness is easier to get than permission. Right? That's a horrible way to live. Because it means you're going to do something that you know is wrong. And so, ladies, don't assume that with your husband, and husbands, don't assume that with your wives. We certainly would not want our children to pick up that way of thinking, because at some point they're going to push it that one step where forgiveness is no longer available, and they're going to have judgment instead. Now, I understand in the grander scheme of things, will I always love my kids? Yes. Will I always forgive my kids as best I can? But do we want them to presume upon forgiveness? Oh, Dad will forgive me if I do this. No, then the idea is don't do that. It's wrong. God will forgive me if I do this. Well, yeah, that's not the point. And so we do take God's forgiveness for granted. And what we fail to realize in the process, and there are a lot of people who live their lives this way, but what we fail to realize in the process is that for oftentimes, sin is its own consequence. It brings its own consequences apart from God. Lord, please forgive me. Okay, you're forgiven. But all of this stuff that results, you still get to live with. And that's just a reality of life. Forgiveness doesn't mean exclusion from consequences. It's like we say to our kids, I'm sorry doesn't fix everything. And the same is true of God. Will God forgive us? Yes. Will he release us from consequence? Sometimes. But we should not presume upon it, because it's not all the time. And there are some things that we can do that you're going to have to eat the consequences. And so we don't want to live a life that says, I'll just do this because God will forgive me. That's true, but it's really not the point. So we read on in verse 9. What then? Are we better than they? Not at all. For we have previously charged both Jews and Greeks that they are all under sin.
As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one.
There is none who understands. There is none who seeks after God.
They are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one.
Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips.
Their speech is filled with their curses.
Their feet are swift to shed blood.
Destruction and misery are in their ways.
And the ways of peace they have not known.
There is no fear of God before their eyes.
Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and that the world may become guilty before God.
Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there should be no flesh to be justified in his sight, but by the law is the knowledge of sin.
But now righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets.
Even the righteous of God, through faith in Jesus Christ, to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference.
Everyone has sinned, and is far away from God's saving presence.
Being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus.
Whom God set forth as a
Propitiation.
propitiation by his blood through faith, to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God has passed over the sins that were previously committed.
To to demonstrate at the present time his righteousness, that he might be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. I'm going to stop there. Verses 9 through 20, we kind of read over, but Paul goes through this lengthy diatribe of just describing people, basically. This is all of us. There is none righteous, no, not one, he says in verse 10, and he keeps building. What's interesting, or one of the most interesting things to me, is how many of you have heard of the Romans Road? Okay, we've occasionally talked about it, we've occasionally used it. The Romans Road is just a series of verses that we would utilize to show somebody their sinfulness and how they can be saved. It is one plan among many that do that. But what's most interesting to me, I grew up in churches where the Romans Road was just like hammered, like hard. And so as a kid, and then coming into where I begin to read and understand the Bible for myself and then study it longer term, like as a career, and then I get to this point and I'm looking at this going, these verses weren't written to unbelievers at all. Which is the most fast. They still work. Don't misunderstand. But the most interesting thing about it is these verses were written to believers. Paul is defending and talking about the issue of salvation to believers using these verses. So he's talking. Here's the nature of people, and so the basis is this. So not only does our sin prove God's righteousness, our sin, and this is shocking, proves that we are unrighteous. How many of you didn't see that one coming? That's, you cannot stand to say, I'm a good person. No, you're not. That's hard to swallow. I will grant you that. But you have yet to meet the person who could honestly say, I'm a good person. Because the reality is, as Paul describes us, and when compared next to who is truly good, and that is God, even Jesus said, you remember the rich young ruler comes to Jesus and he says, good master. And Jesus' response is, there's no one good but God. Why do you address me this way? Now, Jesus was God, and so that was appropriate. But he said, there's no one good but God. And so our sin proves our unrighteousness. But then the remedy, which is really the important part, and he gets it into verse 21 going down, is that our sin is remedied through Jesus. And the big word that Cindy tripped over is propitiation. It's propitiated through Jesus' blood. And propitiation is just a great big word that means to take away the anger. To pacify might be a close synonymous word, but not it doesn't carry enough weight. But to actually remove the cause of anger. And so Jesus, in shedding his blood, actually removed the cause of anger, removes the cause of judgment, removes the cause of wrath. And what is the cause? Sin. So he took the sin away, so there is no longer anything for God to judge. There is no longer anything for God to be angry about or to be wrathful over. There is nothing for God to judge in us because Jesus has removed that. And so we have propitiation by his blood. Through faith. This process took care of the sin, got rid of it. So when God views us, does he view us as sinners? Not at all. Absolutely, God looks at us through rose-colored glasses. And he sees in us only the righteousness of Christ. He sees in us only what is left after sin has been taken away. That's pretty cool, I gotta say. Because I'm pretty screwed up. I'm glad God does not see me the way I see me. Because I see me warts, wrinkles, spare tire, sin nature, and all. God sees me without all of that. Because Jesus' blood rectifies that problem of sin. What is there to say? And so the question is then, I guess, is if through Jesus that sin was taken away, why would we choose to go back? Why would we choose to live in it? Can we choose to live in it? Sure. Does God still see us through rose-colored glasses? Yes. But are we still going to face consequences that he would have otherwise cleared away? And so why would we live that way? And yet, we do. On a good day, we're ivory pure. On a bad day, not so much. So, our sin, the problem? Does it create relational problems between us and the Father? Sure. But it's been dealt with. So, the consistent thing is to live a dealt with it life. I got to stop there because we're going to get invaded and I'm way over time. Questions, comments? I know it's a shock that I would be there. The good news is I got through the entire lesson today. All right, let's pray. Father, we thank you for Jesus. We thank you for his blood that cleanses us. Help us to live clean. In Jesus' good name.